Thank you, Chris. Firstly, it's just a great delight and honor for me to be this year's Barbara Holmes speaker. I'm grateful for 2 full days of hospitality from Dr. Davis and Dr. Wood and others. I've got all manner of connections to this seminary. Firstly, I go way back with Pete Detke. Pete and I had our early careers together at Kalamazoo College. And I just need to tell you that Pete did not become a gifted teacher and friend and scholar. Pete was a legendary teacher at Kalamazoo College from the beginning. So he has been a treasured friend to me all these years. I also have other connections to this place. Andre Johnson was a major player, a figure for me in the book that just came out a couple months ago called The New Abolition. And his work on Henry McNeill Turner. L. Young is, of course, now my colleague at Union Theological Seminary. I greatly admire the service that Barbara Holmes gave to this seminary and this community. In fact, a few years ago, I was on a search committee at Union Theological Seminary that tried to steal Barbara away from you. So now we're both at a loss. And now when I go home and I tell my friends, Cornell West, Jim Cohn, Aubrey Hendricks, and Melissa Harris Perry, hey, I have given the Barbara Holmes lectures. They're going to go, are you kidding? How did they invite you? So all of this has been just wonderful for me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. Last night, as some of you know, I gave a talk about one of my favorite social gospel intellectuals, Reverend Ransom. And today I'm going to speak about the black social gospel more broadly as a tradition of thought and activism. The black social gospel is wrongly and strangely overlooked. Yet this is the category that best describes Martin Luther King Jr., his chief mentors, his closest movement allies, and the entire tradition of black church racial justice activism reaching back to the 1880s. The white social gospel arose during the progressive era and was already a movement by the mid-1880s with national organizations and a movement agenda linked with progressivism. It had its heyday from 1900 to 1917, and it's justly renowned. It created the ecumenical movement, and it put social justice on the agenda of the ecumenical churches, founding the peace and justice organizations that still operate in Protestant and Catholic denominations. By the 1930s, it was mostly a peace movement. But the black social gospel is far more significant than the famous white one, as I said last night. It had its own integrity and identity while sharing important things with white progressive Christianity. The black social gospel grew out of the abolitionist tradition and responded to the crisis of a new era, the abandonment of Reconstruction, the evisceration of constitutional rights, an upsurge of racial lynching and Jim Crow abuse, struggles for mere survival in every part of the nation, and the excruciating question of what a new abolition would require. All right, that's how I started last night, just to set up something quite particular about Reverend Ransom. Today, I got to start with something far more broader, because I've got just the problem of, hey, if you're right, how is it that we haven't been talking about the black social gospel up till now? Numerous conventions have long kept the black social gospel from being remembered. Supposedly, there was no black social gospel worth noting. It had only a few proponents who had no impact. Black churches were too provincial and conservative to support social justice politics and social gospel theology. Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois were not involved with the social gospel, so this category does not illuminate Washington versus Du Bois. Religious intellectuals no longer mattered anyway by the end of the 19th century, so it doesn't matter if we ignore whatever black religious intellectuals might have existed. Reinhold Niebuhr shredded the social gospel, so forget the social gospel. And the social gospel movement that did exist, the famous white one, did not concern itself with racial justice. These are the conventions of the field. They were for decades, and all of them are just flat wrong. The black social gospel had numerous proponents in its early years. including notable figures such as William Simmons, Alexander Crummell, Reverdy Ransom, Alexander Walters, Ida Wells Barnett, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., and Richard Wright Jr. They were an embattled minority in their denominations because the social gospel was divisive and it threatened to get people in trouble. The founders and their successors fought hard for the right to advocate progressive theology and social justice politics. Washington versus Du Bois was at the center of the argument until the Du Bois faction prevailed. Some of the founders were active in the ecumenical movement, always prodding it to risk more for racial justice. They were succeeded by a generation of leaders, more familiar names, that espoused social gospel theology from the beginning of their careers. Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, George Kelsey, J. Pius Barber, Vernon Johns, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Howard Thurman. Every figure that I just named was a role model for Martin Luther King Jr. Their legacy is immense, paving the way for the King generation of James Lawson, Joe Lowry, Andy Young, Bernard Lafayette, Jim Bevel, Pauline Murray, Diane Nash, and other civil rights leaders of the 1950s and 60s, which was the heyday of the black social gospel. Some of the second and third generation figures, especially King, were influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr, but none of them believed that Niebuhr invalidated the social gospel. Yet it was routinely claimed for decades that there was no black social gospel, and so its founders are forgotten. Martin Luther King did not come from nowhere, nor did the embattled theology of social justice that he espoused. The things that defined the black social gospel made it distinct and controversial, and so last November I published a large book on the founding generation titled The New Abolition, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Black Social Gospel. Next year, there will be a companion volume titled Breaking White Supremacy, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Social Gospel. So, you are catching me in an in-between moment. My book is finally out there, but my head is in the one to come. And today, I'm just going to pull up both ends. This tradition, like any tradition, can be defined broadly or narrowly. Broadly, there were four groups, plus a tiny socialist flank. First group identified with Booker T. Washington and his program of political accommodation and economic uplift. The second group contended that black Americans needed their own nation because white America was just hopelessly hostile to black Americans. A&E Bishop Henry McNeil Turner and Episcopal intellectual Alexander Crummell were leading black nationalists. The third group advocated protest activism for racial justice, strongly opposing Booker T. A&E bishops Reverdy Ransom and Richard Wright Jr. were leading figures in that group. The fourth group navigated between the pro-Washington and anti-Washington forces, imploring against factional division. Its leading figures included Baptist minister Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and Baptist educator Nanny Burroughs. All four of these ideological factions existed before W.E.B. Du Bois emerged as the intellectual leader of the protest tradition. A full-fledged black social gospel tradition emerged from them, mostly, not entirely, from the third and fourth groups. It stood for social justice, religion, and modern critical consciousness. This full-orbed black social gospel, which is my operative definition of the category, combined an emphasis on black dignity and personhood with protest activism for racial justice, a comprehensive social justice agenda, an insistence that authentic Christian faith is incompatible with racial prejudice, an emphasis on the social ethical teaching of Jesus, and an acceptance of modern scholarship and social consciousness. One reason that the early black social gospel has been ignored is that Washington versus Du Bois sat right in the middle of it. We tend not to think of them as religious figures, and they overshadowed the ministers who argued about Washington versus Du Bois. But Booker Washington, in his time, was widely regarded as the epitome of the social gospel, and he remained an iconic figure in American life for decades, after he lost the argument and passed on. Booker Washington was complex, wily, opaque, and awesomely accomplished. He built Tuskegee Institute in the face of KKK terrorism, a mania of lynching, a southern civil religion of lost cause propaganda, and a suffocating plague of disenfranchisement and Jim Crow abuse. He cultivated an image of simple altruism while fighting in a savvy, calculated fashion for as much power as he could get, fulfilling the American fantasy of ascending from poverty and disadvantage to greatness. Booker T publicly accommodated disenfranchisement and segregation, and he privately organized legal efforts to thwart both. He was actually one of our leading figures in trying to thwart both. He denied that he made federal patronage appointments for black Americans long after he routinely made all of them. He hobnobbed with the high and mighty, but he stayed in touch with the struggles of ordinary people. He attracted wealthy benefactors. He became an advisor to 4 U.S. presidents. He launched hundreds of community schools, and he amassed a powerful political machine. He bought black newspapers and controlled them, denying that too. For a while, he was so dominant that many Bookerites believed there was just no such thing as a legitimate opposition to him. Booker T believed it adamantly. He keenly understood that most white Southerners of his time did not want black Americans to succeed at anything besides picking cotton. Any black success at anything else raised the frightening specter of what they called Negro rule. A black postmaster represented Negro rule. A black shopkeeper, a black teacher, a black lawyer represented Negro rule. But to give African Americans a glimmer of opportunity in a brutally hostile context, Booker T pretended not to know it. He got to be number one by bartering the civil and political rights of black Americans for a season of interracial peace and economic opportunity. On the few occasions that he directly explained his strategy, he wrote quintessential descriptions of political realism. But everything got worse for African Americans during this ostensible season, while Washington ascended to national preeminence, setting him up for the devastating objection that black Americans had not selected him to be number one. Booker T was the first black leader to be selected by white Americans, an arrangement that he lived to see unravel. For the race problem in America was white racism, and the antidote to it had no chance whatsoever of coming out of Alabama. Washington epitomized one influential version of the social gospel. He was powerfully linked with the conservative assimilation wing of the white social gospel, led by Brooklyn minister Lyman Abbott and Harvard Unitarian minister Francis Greenwood Peabody, who was a long time on the board of Hampton Institute. Abbott serialized Washington's memoir, Up From Slavery, to his magazine audience and helped to create Booker T as his national celebrity and lauded him as the answer to what they called the race problem. For Washington, religion was practical. It nurtured the correct moral virtues, and it helped to build a good society, exactly as white social gospel leaders said. Every alternative to Booker T was compelled to define its relationship to him. Nationalists took the Turner path of national separation and or African immigration. Then as now, there were different kinds of black nationalism. The idea that all people of African descent share something as a nation or as a people. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the positive basis for national belonging was sometimes biological, rendering the nation as analogous to a biological organism, and or ontological, making a claim about the distinct being of blackness, and or cultural or socio-historical, making a claim about black cultural authenticity or distinctiveness. But defined that broadly, there were nationalists in all 4 streams of black social Christianity. The emphatically nationalist group espoused more stringent forms of nationalism, contending that black Americans were a distinct people needing to create a sovereign nation state And even if the statehood project failed, well, at least a black civilization. Some nationalists devoted themselves to colonizing West Africa, following Turner, or Haiti, following James Hawley. But many eventually gave up on immigration, following Cromwell. Much of the nationalist tradition shared the emphases of Cromwell and Turner on moral uplift, authority, elite leadership, and the shortcomings of ordinary black Americans. Despite its rhetoric of separation, the nationalist tradition, ironically, played a major role in transmitting assimilationist values into African American culture. Most black nationalists were politically conservative, and nearly all of them were culturally conservative. Black nationalism had an electrifying moment after World War I with the rise of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. A generation earlier, Cromwell and Turner clashed over the question whether nationalists should continue to strive for a separate nation-state, preferably in West Africa. Turner became the dominant figure in this school of thought and activism by saying yes. The third group vehemently opposed Washington's strategy and his Tuskegee machine, calling for a new abolitionist politics of racial and social justice. The full-fledged black social gospel emerged mostly from this group. There were many others besides Ransom, Wright, and Ida Wells Barnett, notably Baptist ministers Jim Diggs and Peter James Bryant, Congregational minister Byron Gunner, Episcopal rectors Robert Bagnall and George Fraser Miller. But they are all forgotten. The fourth group helped to sway how the argument over Bookerism turned out. In the early 1900s, the groups advocating protest and accommodation fought each other ferociously, with a lot of name-calling. Both sides alienated people that disliked ideological bickering. Religious communities naturally brought together the rival camps and the non-aligned. At church, ministers appealed to Christian fellowship and racial solidarity. Moreover, many ministers had friends on both sides of the partisan divide. The fourth group urged that Du Bois-style militancy and Washington-style realism were both indispensable. In addition to Burroughs and Powell Sr., leading figures included sociologists Monroe Work and George Haynes, Methodist minister William Henry Brooks, Baptist feminists Lucy Smith and Sarah Layton. Meanwhile, there was a tiny flank that held out against capitalism. Baptist ministers George Woodby and George Slater were leading figures in this group. Woodby had a long career as a Socialist Party organizer and was also active in the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. There were black socialists besides Du Bois and Ransom in the mainstream of the NAACP, but socialist activism had a lot going against it in black communities. A fantasized solidarity with a racist white proletariat, the specter of appearing to be anti-American, and the desire of African Americans to own property and to succeed in its existing system. These very factors suppressed Du Bois' socialism for 20 years. For some in the fourth group, the founding of the NAACP in 1909 and the subsequent fading of Washington nullified the necessity of making a both-and argument, while others stuck to it for the rest of their lives. Two AME stalwarts with fiery temperaments, Ida Wells and Reverdy Ransom, played crucial roles in founding the black social gospel before Baptists took it over. I talked about Ransom last night, and we just made a decision. This is how I'm going to save time in this talk by just cutting Ransom out this morning. In the 1890s, Wells conducted a brave personal crusade against the epidemic of lynching and appealed to ministers for support. In the early going, there were only two that she could count on: Ransom and Henry McNeil Turner. Growing that list was an essential project of the early black social gospel, which AME Zion Bishop Alexander Walters took up as a movement organizing imperative. Wells told her audiences that lynching was about race hatred. It was not about rape. Black men were not raping white women, although some were having consensual sexual relationships with white women. Lying, hypocrisy, and racial hatred folded together in this area, and somebody had to show that lynching, the entire lynching mania had nothing to do with rape. Wells recoiled at digging into this subject because her moralism ran very deep. Often she attended 3 or 4 church services per Sunday, and she held preachers to a high standard of holiness. She hated that somebody turned out to be her, because writing about lynching was incendiary and dangerous, and it forced her to flee from this city. And sometimes it compelled her to write about salacious things. Wells grieved that the salacious aspects of her reporting harmed her moral reputation. In her telling, white men were the barbarians of the time. White women were more sexual than their husbands dared to imagine. Black women were victimized by the predatory sexuality of white men, and black men caught hell for all of it. Speaking anywhere in the Deep South on this topic was unthinkable. Wells tried to lecture in border states, but that didn't go well. She spoke often in the North, mostly on the white social gospel circuit, and spectacularly in 2 tours in England, where that's another version of the white social gospel. But she failed to build the organization that she wanted for lack of funds and moral support. Later on, she hooked on with the Afro-American Council, but Booker T took it over and she resigned in disgust. Later, she tried to work with the NAACP, but Wells did not like Du Bois or his enabler, Mary White Ovington, so she settled for loner activism. Wells had trouble working with others, which marginalized her in protest organizations and made her easy to forget after she was gone. Although she did continue to work in the club women's movement, even though year after year, they refused to elect her to a national leadership role. It was the one organization she just hung in there with and said, I just need to be humble about this. I've got to be with these club women, some of which belong to organizations called the Ida B. Wells Club. And stay in there even though they refused, they never elect her to a leadership organization. Her autobiography, she noticed near the end of her life that people were writing books about lynching that somehow failed even to mention her. Her autobiography, which she wrote then at the end of her life, then went unpublished for 40 years after she died. And she was not recovered until the Black Power and women's movements arose. But she was a catalyzing figure for what became the black social gospel, especially for her pastor in Chicago, Reverend Ransom. The nationalist tradition said that separatism of some kind was the only salvation for black Americans. The group that formed around W.B. Du Bois, led by Ransom and Richard Wright, had a better idea, even if it eventually required cutting a deal with white liberals, something that black social gospel leaders were willing to do with no lack of commitment to abolishing white oppression. I've got over 150 pages just substantiating that argument in the New Abolition, because there's a lot of literature out there that just implies as though that didn't happen. Du Bois is central to this story because he changed the conversation and he made everybody deal with him. He did not merely take up an existing critique of Washington's strategy, putting it more colorfully or memorably. He inspired a revolution of consciousness that defined the problem of the 20th century. He provided a language for the problem of the color line, and he helped to launch the Pan-African movement, the Niagara movement, and the NAACP. And he helped to radicalize the black social gospel through his influence on Ransom, Wright, Walters, Waldron, Powell, Johnson, Mays, King, and others. The double consciousness that Du Bois projected onto all African Americans was deeply and powerfully true for him, and a source of creativity in him. He was simultaneously black and American. He grew up with very little experience of racial prejudice and abuse, yet he became an unsurpassed critic of the color line. He railed against the evils of white civilization, while affirming the intellectualism and progressive social ideals that he internalized from white civilization, especially Harvard and University of Berlin. Du Bois fashioned an alternative to the draining debate between nationalists and integrationists by affirming his own tortured double consciousness. Black Americans had to stop taking sides about which of their selves to give up, opting for a richer, contentious, full-bodied struggle for liberation and radical democracy. Du Bois was educated during the heyday of evolutionary idealism and social Darwinism, and his early writings were shot through with both. It took him years to drop neo-Lamarckian theory and social Darwinism, to temper his emphasis on moral failings and uplift elitism, to let go of romantic imperialism, and to pull back from his neo-Hegelian idealism. Later, he absorbed Freud and Marx, and he dropped the too simple idealistic, dualistic idea of double consciousness. But through all his shifts and phases, he fixed on exemplary individuality, the character, status, personhood, and circumstances of personal examples. He construed his own life as an example through which he fashioned his ideas about race, which helps to explain why he wrote 4 autobiographies. Du Bois mined the fissure between his status as a member of a denigrated caste and his role as a race leader. He stuck to this focus long after he mitigated its elitist drawbacks by embracing radical democratic socialism. For many years, Du Bois had to live down the charge that he cared about elite performers, while Booker T cared about ordinary people. There was always something ridiculous about this comparison, and yet Du Bois provided grist for it by insisting, in the spirit of Alexander Crummell, the one person he looked up to for a long time, quote, "The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men," unquote. This trope provided quotable material for countless sermons, editorials, church bulletins, and commencement addresses. Gradually, Du Bois bridled at hearing it from speakers lacking his commitment to radical democracy. He got increasingly forthright about economic justice and the ravages of global capitalism. But that did not dissuade him from focusing on what it meant to be an exemplar in a wretched time. Du Bois loathed religious orthodoxy because he said it stunted human souls. He could be blistering on this theme. In 1940, speaking at Wilberforce University's commencement, he excoriated the school's Christian legacy as, quote, "childish belief in fairy tales, a word-of-mouth adherence to dogma, and a certain sectarian exclusiveness," unquote. Imagine that's your commencement speaker. Wilberforce's tradition of religious orthodoxy, he charged, was, quote, "a miserable apprehension of the teaching of Christ," unquote. But Du Bois had a spiritual wellspring of his own, a keen appreciation of Jesus, and a lover's quarrel with the black church. David Levering Lewis is the towering Du Bois scholar that all Du Bois scholars have to deal with, to our benefit. But Lewis is tone deaf to the vibrant, yearning, heterodox spirituality that just surged through Du Bois' work, refusing to see it as religious, much less as Christian. For years, it just frustrated me that scholars routinely recycled this religion-unfriendly reading, although Manning Marable and Cornel West did hold out against it. Recently, Ed Bloom and John Kahn have helpfully interpreted Du Bois as a religious thinker. Bloom fits Du Bois too securely into the tradition of black radical Christianity, and Kahn fits him too securely into the tradition of pragmatic religious naturalism. I believe that Du Bois was double-minded and purposely elusive about his personal relationship to Christianity. But however that lays out, Du Bois had a passionate religious spirit. His writings were strewn with religious images and references throughout his career, even after he supposedly dropped religion for Marxism. His book, The Souls of Black Folk, famously invoked our spiritual strivings and lauded the spirituals. His book, Dark Water, began with Du Bois' social gospel credo. It conjured a black baby Jesus in his essay, The Second Coming. It conjured an adult black Jesus in his scathing essay, Jesus Christ in Texas. And it ended with a hymn to the peoples in which the Buddha walked with Jesus. As late as the 1950s, Du Bois was still writing about what he called saving the tattered shreds of God. His spiritual sensibility came through to many readers. They caught that a religious, arguably Christian passion lay behind Du Bois's furious attacks on unworthy ministers and church dogmatism. Even at Wilberforce, lashing the university for hiding behind mediocre religion, Du Bois stumped for social gospel religion, telling the graduates it was not too late to mobilize the churches for social change. By 1940, that was an echo of what the younger Du Bois had hoped the church would become under the sway of the social gospel. In the early 20th century, he was a critical booster, taking for granted that the movement for black liberation had to be religion-friendly. Nothing compared to the black church as a source of inspiration, hope, solidarity, entertainment, belonging, moral language, transcendent meaning. Any movement worth building had to share in the life of the black church, speaking its language of hope and redemption. The Niagara movement, and later the NAACP, had to have religious leaders, reaching beyond the usual circle of urban professionals. The Baptists came late to this call because they had trouble organizing for anything. But in the 1920s, they surged to the front. All of the King's role models were figures in that line. And when King founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, he stacked the organization with Baptist social gospel ministers of his generation. The social gospel leaders that influenced King stubbornly believed that ordinary, prosaic, humble, flawed, usually conservative religious congregations were the key to changing American society, period. They shared with Reverend Ransom and Adam Clayton Powell Sr. a fascination with the revolt against British colonialism in India led by Gandhi. Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, and William Stewart Nelson preached constantly about Gandhi in the 1930s, getting King's attention. My second volume on the Black Social Gospel, alas, is going to be just as long as the first one, which means it's going to be around 700 pages, because it will take hundreds of pages just to deal with the figures who influenced King directly, and the social gospel figures who worked with him, especially Andy Young, Jim Lawson, Jim Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, John Lewis, Jesse Jackson, Joe Lowry. I take a strong view of King's central importance in this story, and of the roles played by SCLC and SNCC. I believe that King's formation in the Southern Black Baptist Church and his graduate education at Northern Theological institutions were both important to his identity, his thinking, and his career. Any reading that minimizes one or the other misconstrues King, which is what happens when scholars fail to credit the black social gospel that enabled King to play this unique mediating role. King soared to fame because he distinctly bridged the disparities between black and white church communities, between middle-class blacks and white liberals, between black nationalists and black conservatives, between church communities and the academy, and above all, between the northern and southern civil rights movements. He was the product of a broadly black social Christian family and church that prepared him for this role. King was nurtured in the piety and idioms of an urban, middle-class Black Baptist family and congregation. He deeply absorbed the evangelical piety and social concerns preached by his father. He got a more intellectual version of both things when he studied at Morehouse College, where Mays influenced him. In seminary, he adopted a socialist version of social gospel theology and a personalist version of post-Kantian idealist philosophy, and he acquired a conflicted attraction to Gandhian nonviolence. Throughout his career, he was committed to democratic socialism, personalist theological liberalism, and Gandhian nonviolence. More importantly, he got more radical and angry as a consequence of failing to break white supremacy. He was more radical and angry in 1960 than in 1955. More in 1965 than in 1960. And more at the end than ever. At the end, he spurned his access to the establishment in order to stand with the poor and oppressed, struggling against complex forms of oppression implicated in relations of racial, economic, national, and imperial power. On social gospel socialism, Walter Rauschenbusch was the foremost intellectual influence in King, and it mattered greatly to King that Johnson, Mays, Thurman, and Barber all admired Rauschenbusch and considered themselves followers of him on that issue. On personalism, King's doctoral advisor, Harold DeWolf, was his chief mentor, although he knew a lot of personalism before he got to BU, because he'd gone to grocery. On Gandhian nonviolence, King was vague and uncertain until Montgomery erupted and Bayard Rustin rushed to Montgomery. King had a full-fledged socialist, personalist, pacifist model and his dean at BU, Walter Mueller. But more importantly, when King entered the ministry, he had models of everything he cared about in Johnson, Mays, Thurman, and Barber. If they could blend black church religion, modern intellectualism, and social justice politics, so could he. In fact, he was called to do so. The best social gospel theologians were socialists, which he just took for granted from seminary onward. Personalism fit black church preaching like no other philosophy, which lured King to Boston University in the first place. Moreover, all of his role models treasured Gandhi. King stuck to these commitments throughout his career in changing configurations. He had to camouflage what he believed about economic justice until the so-called later King stopped doing so. He liked that he had a philosophical foundation, a variant of post-Kantian idealism, although he acquired critics who thought it was quaint that he wanted one. And he insisted repeatedly that he was committed to Gandhian nonviolence as a spiritual, ethical way of life, not merely as a movement strategy, although he accepted some of Reinhold Niebuhr's critiques of both. King got more radical every year, not from repudiating anything that he believed previously, but from failing to break white supremacy and other forms of oppression. When he told the story of his intellectual development, he emphasized the white theologians and philosophers that he read in seminary, which obscured the role of his cultural and religious formation. It took a great deal of scholarly deconstruction to correct the misleading impression that his own account gave. The black church was home and bred to King. He was steeped in its belief in a personal God of judgment, grace, and miracles, a gospel of redemption and sanctification, and a strong insistence that the gospel has a social dimension. He learned that he was somebody prized by a personal God, no matter what white society said. The revisionist scholarship on King that started in the 1980s rightly reclaimed the role of the black church in King's life and work, and it laid the groundwork for the scholarship of the 1990s that wrestled with King's sexual behavior and his faulty citation practices. However, even some of the best King scholars brokered these latter issues by wrongly contending that King took a cavalier attitude toward the theology he studied in seminary. David Garrow and Keith Miller claimed that King's graduate education was not much of an education, and King never cared about academic theology anyway. Garrow said that King pretended to learn what his professors pretended to teach him. Miller said that as soon as King entered the ministry, he dismissively threw off his professors' strange artificial tongue and their ivory tower theological formalism. David Levering Lewis followed suit, declaring that the revelations about King's plagiarism shockingly refuted Lewis's own biography of King. Quote, "Who he was simply escaped me," unquote. Now Lewis had a different picture. Quote, "A picture emerges of King, the young graduate student, tooling about Boston on dates in his green Chevrolet, cavalierly submitting essays and dissertation chapters that were just mosaics of the works of others, and of smug professors, willfully indulging a bright enough degree candidate who, his studies completed, would return to the South to serve his people. Unquote. These are the most distinguished scholars we have in the field saying this. These claims by highly distinguished scholars encouraged others to pile on against liberal theology and personalism, dismissing both of them as not worth studying anyway. Repeatedly, liberal theology was described in stereotypical terms as perfectionistic religious humanism that didn't believe in sin, and personalist philosophy got similar treatment as a thinly philosophical version of liberal theology. For example, homiletic scholar Richard Lisher, in his otherwise outstanding book on King's preaching artistry, dismissed King's debts to liberal theology and personalism with flat stereotypes that demeaned King and his teachers. Contrary to Lisher and numerous others, the theologians that King studied at seminary, especially William Newton Clark, William Adams Brown, and Walter Rauschenbusch, were long, strong, and vivid on the ravages of personal and collective evil. So were the personalist theologians under whom King studied. This is not a slippery matter of interpretation. The theologians that King studied practically battered their readers with descriptions of sin as badness, depravity, selfishness, and collective evil. Rauschenbusch called it the kingdom of evil, a far stronger organic social concept than anything you can get out of Reinhold Niebuhr. But you have to actually read them to know that. Lisher and others are just content with stereotypes. Lisher says that personalism was devoid of the soul of religion. That's a quote. And it lacked any capacity to nurture a common life. King would have been astonished to read that Mulder, De Wolf, and S. Paul Schilling knew nothing of the soul of religion, and they lacked a social ethic too. Mulder exemplified the fusion of vibrant personal faith and social justice passion that King admired and emulated. Theologically and ethically, King was so close to De Wolf that he channeled De Wolf's signature arguments throughout his career. Schilling wrote searching, vulnerable, spiritually powerful works on redemptive suffering and the ethical demands of the gospel. It would be hard to find anywhere 3 theologians less deserving of the ridicule that has been heaped upon them by scholars seeking to minimize King's graduate education and to belittle his teachers. King buttressed his black church faith with a personalist theological variant of the modern West's richest intellectual tradition, post-Kantian idealism. He was highly self-conscious and strategic about why he did so and how it worked for him. Mays, Kelsey, and Barber modeled for King why he needed the intellectualism that his graduate education provided. Then King studied under De Wolf and wrote a dense dissertation on why personality matters. Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman identified personality with limited human personality, which God transcended. King countered that personality as such simply means self-consciousness and self-direction. Applied to God, the idea of personality doesn't apply any limitation at all. More importantly, the idea that God is good requires the presupposition that God is personal. No theology, King believed, is better than philosophy, the philosophy underlying it. And the best philosophy for theology upholds a quantitative pluralism in recognizing the manifold realities of sense experience and a qualitative monism in affirming that reality has a unifying ground in God's being. That's his dissertation. This fusion of black church faith and liberal personalist theology was King's mainstay in a turbulent world. He said so repeatedly, acknowledging that for him the crisis of belief was personal, cultural, social, and political. He gave highest place to his belief in a personal God and the infinite value of human personality. If the worth of personality was the ultimate value in life, then racism was distinctly evil. Evil is precisely that which annihilates and degrades personality. King expounded this theological worldview to all manner of audiences in all manner of settings. It was not just church talk to him, and his intellectualizing was not just to impress white intellectuals, although he worked hard at reaching white audiences. The social gospel mattered to him because it was inherently social. It held fast to the gospel belief in salvation, and it was unabashedly political, a call to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice. King was a profound theologian who showed, better than anybody since the 19th century, how to speak theologically in public, clearly, with daring and conviction, in an ecumenical spirit. The social gospel acquired its name by proposing to change society. It took on the ravages of racism, militarism, and injustice in the name of the gospel imperative to help the poor and afflicted and to break the chains of oppression. It grew out of the abolitionist movements of the black and white social Christian communities, and like abolitionism, it marshaled Christian arguments for a cause that had little support in the history of Christianity. The churches blessed slavery for centuries before abolitionism arose in the 19th century. The abolitionists had to buck that record when they claimed that slavery was anti-Christian. Their descendants in the radical wings of black and white social Christianity had a similar problem when they claimed a religious warrant for theologies of social justice and abolishing white supremacy. To King, it mattered greatly that he had forerunners in this work and that a movement for it was building, however hard it was to see in the America of his seminary years, the early 1950s. Cornel West, delineating the principal, intellectual, and existential sources that shape King, rightly names four, in order of importance: prophetic black church Christianity, prophetic liberal Christianity, prophetic Gandhian nonviolence, and prophetic American civil religion. West says that King embodied the best of American Christendom by synthesizing these sources. But this project was not unique to King, for it defines precisely what the black social gospel had become before King emerged. King stood in a tradition of founders and mentors who heard the prophetic gospel in the black church, who appropriated social gospel liberalism, who engaged Gandhi as soon as the Gandhian Revolution began, and who called America to stop betraying its vaunted ideals. The weakest link in this chain was the one that white America lifted up after King was gone. King, the dreamer who called America to its own greed. King himself played down this trope in his later life, as it did not comport very well with the surging tide of black anger that he shared with the Black Power movement. It became even more problematic as soon as King was gone. The more that white liberals embraced King as a hero, the more ambiguous he became for blacks still denigrated by white society. It became hard to remember. I remember it well. It became very hard to remember that King was radical, militant, and angry. He seemed to be wholly outstripped by Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, failing to break through his image as the civil rights leader best suited to prop up white liberalism. Even King's sympathetic biographer, David Levering Lewis, writing 2 years after King's death, contended that King specialized in making his audiences feel good. King, Lewis wrote, evoked, quote, deeply pleasurable emotions in the middle-class blacks and whites who flocked to hear him, never threatening anyone. Almost until the end, the meliorism of the social gospel, and more viscerally that of the black bourgeoisie, stayed with Martin despite the instructive lessons in Marx and Niebuhr, unquote. Well, you know, there was some truth in that, but it's also, its effect is just totally misleading. Martin Luther King did not become the most hated man in America on a misunderstanding. His supposedly unthreatening meliorism obliterated more structural evil than all his critics combined. He struck with audacity and forcefulness in the most hateful cities he could find. He purposely stacked his organization with the most confrontational and contentious personalities he could find. Wyatt Walker, Fred Shuttlesworth, Jim Bevel, C.T. Vivian, Hosea Williams, later Jesse Jackson. Because only people like that would eagerly raise hell in Birmingham, St. Augustine, Selma, and Chicago, and just keep coming back for more. In 1964, barely a year after I Have a Dream, King told Alex Haley, quote, "I never cease to wonder at the amazing presumption of much of white society, assuming that they have the right to bargain with the Negro for his freedom. This continued, arrogant ladling out of pieces of the rights of citizenship has begun to generate a fury in the Negro." Unquote. That was the feeling that retired the word Negro the following year. King was always more radical than he seemed. By the end, he was more radical than anybody around him. He frightened and appalled the civil rights establishment by coming out against the Vietnam War. He took the struggle north into Chicago, where Bevel was eager to go and Jackson joined the staff, but nearly everybody else on his team was opposed. Bayard Rustin and Hosea Williams were adamantly against the Chicago campaign. Then King committed to the Poor People's Campaign, and he had to hire Bernard Lafayette to run it because his entire executive staff was against him, even Bevel. Near the end, King doubled down on the path of public sacrifice, dragging others along. He had never taken care of himself, and he would not change his ways merely because he was deeply exhausted and depressed. As a child, he had sung that he wanted to be more and more like Jesus. In his last years, he bore his cross so intently and with such disregard for his health that his friends suspected a death wish. The Poor People's Campaign, which he launched at the lowest point of his life, topped his previous forays into risky, controversial, chaotic protest. He would not be moved by strategic arguments about political reforms, even though they were strong and substantial arguments. He would not be shamed into reverting to middle-class politics. Now he outflanked even Bevel, his usual barometer of going too far. Bevel, King, had to stand with the poorest of the poor and afflicted. Otherwise, he was not really a follower of Jesus. In March, he told the New York City Union that the next march on Washington would have black Americans because black people are poor, and Puerto Ricans because they're poor too, and Mexican Americans and Native Americans because they're mistreated, and poor Appalachian whites that repudiated racism. He knew what he needed to do and with whom he needed to be. He only didn't know, really, where this was headed politically. King was deeply exhausted most of the time in the early years of the movement. In the mid-1960s, he was unfathomably exhausted and depressed. And then it got worse. On occasion, he acknowledged that he might be too exhausted to go on. He'd need to take a year off. He fantasized about teaching at Union Theological Seminary, or maybe just giving up and going to Switzerland. But mostly he just bowled forward, bearing his cross, enduring one sleepless night after another, and rousing himself with sermonic riffs about the view from the mountaintop. Andy Young would say, well, when he gave that mountaintop talk, that's when we knew he had just hit at the very bottom. He told the SCLC staff, when I took up the cross, I recognized its meaning. The cross is something that you bear, and ultimately, it's something that you die on. Yes. Every sermon that he ever gave was a gloss on the beloved community, the kingdom hope of a regenerated society. He was an exemplar of his theme that freedom has no reality apart from power. Power is integral to hope and liberation. Integration requires equal access to political and economic power. Freedom is precisely participation in power. For King, the goal of the civil rights movement was precisely to transform the lack of power of black Americans into creative, vital, interpersonal, organized power. All could be free, but only if all were empowered to participate. Freedom and integration went together to build the beloved community, a universal goal embracing all peoples and nations. King epitomized the black social gospel at its best and most radical, which made him the first in the line of what came to be called, shortly after his death, liberation theology. But that is not how it seemed at the time. Liberation theology arose within the Black Power movement, where King was problematic. He exemplified the ethic of self-sacrificial love and nonviolent resistance to oppression as a way of life, not merely a method. He insisted that integration was an essential goal of the civil rights movement, notwithstanding that the movement really had no workable concept of it. SCLC veterans like Ralph Abernathy, who retained a simple concept of integration, were disabused of it in the Poor People's Campaign when they tried to impose it, and they failed utterly. The pendulum swung toward liberation by any means necessary, away from King's emphasis on integration and nonviolence. Violence versus nonviolence was not the issue because giving primacy to it preempted what might be necessary for liberation and self-respecting community. In the aftermath of King's assassination, James Cone took for granted that King was a major source and inspiration of the liberating theology that was needed. But the King valorized by white liberals and black church leaders struck Cone as the exemplar of a white liberal ideal, not a symbol of black liberation. Cone's respect for King jostled with feelings of ambivalence, and he hated what white liberals made of King. In that conflicted brew of feelings and reactions, black liberation theology was born. My work on this subject is distinctly important to me and is long in coming. For 20 years, I have sprinkled discussions of the black social gospel into various books. 20 years ago, there were not many of us, although David Wells, Ralph Luker, and Calvin Morris did pioneering work in this area. In the past generation, the field has moved in this direction because Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Peter Paris, Tony Penn, Randall Jelks, Wallace Best, Walter Fluker, Jonathan Walton, Juan Floyd Thomas, and others have recovered aspects of this story. The black social gospel had many blinders and deficiencies. It was led almost entirely by male ministers, and very few of them advocated for the rights or public agency of women. William Simmons, Henry McNeil Turner, and Reverdy Ransom were notable exceptions. Martin Luther King was not an exception. Ida Wells Barnett and Nanny Burroughs are major figures in my first volume, and I have extensive discussions of the National Association of Colored Women. Just a godsend for black women who can't get leadership positions in the church. In Volume 2, however, Polly Murray is the only woman of comparable stature to these figures, and she was an outsider knocking on the door for the entire time that this story was going on. I have extensive discussions of Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Fannie Lou Hamer, but they were organizers. They were not public intellectuals. And Baker's exclusion from a leadership role in SCLC symbolizes exactly the clerical gender problem at issue. Barbara Diane Savage, in her luminous book on the politics of black religion, Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, notes that three scholars had the greatest influence on the historiography of 19th and early 20th century black American Christianity: Du Bois, Carter Woodson, and Benjamin Meigs. All were unsettled by the emotional fervor of rural black worship and all the sanctification churches. All of them appreciated the emotional vitality of black religion while calling for modernized churches committed to social justice theology. All of them said sympathetic things about the women that comprised and sustained the black churches. And all three of them perpetuated the view that black churches needed strong and progressive male ministers more than they needed anything else. Savage aptly observes that Du Bois, Woodson, and Meigs, by giving highest priority to developing a male clerical elite, silenced the two largest groups in this picture: the majority of church members, who were women, and the majority of men, who remained outside the churches. Woodson founded the Journal of Negro History in what became Black History Month. He attended Shiloh Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. because, he said, that's where the best people are. Woodson said that women were obviously the best Christians and they kept the churches going. But his only word for them was just to carry on as they were. He had a bold vision of a united black superchurch that got rid of all the denominations. But he envisioned no female leaders in it. That was typical. For similar reasons, these church leaders had no progressive inklings concerning gay and lesbian sexuality, a subject on which both of the Adam Clayton Powells spoke vehemently from the pulpit of Abyssinian Church. The black social gospel thus had shortcomings in the very areas that roil churches today. This is a story about ministers that conceived the social gospel as a new abolitionist theology and that raised the demand for racial justice to a new level of public agency. I am therefore making a continuity argument about a wrongly overlooked tradition, but always in a way that holds to the specific line that led to King and beyond. For all that Daddy King influenced his son, neither Daddy King nor any of his buddies would have kept the bus strike going in Montgomery, or struck hard in Birmingham, or opposed the Vietnam War, or spurned President Johnson, or emphasized economic justice, or called a poor people's campaign of marchers to the nation's capital. The King movement must be continually re-narrated, refashioning what happened and why it fell short of Martin's dream of a decent society, much less the beloved community. Thank you, friends.